Well, good morning and good evening to all our online viewers joining us wherever you may be. My name is Russell Shell. I am the Executive Director at the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan policy. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and informed opinions about current developments related to Taiwan. We also organize public seminars, like the webinar that you are all participating in today, where we invite leading thinkers, writers, authors, officials, to discuss issues related to Taiwan. We also organize an annual symposium. Our next symposium will be in a couple of weeks, and where we discuss the current and future of U.S.-Taiwan relations. In addition to these policy research programs, we also offer scholarships and fellowships to academics who are interested to conduct field research in Taiwan, and vice versa for Taiwanese researchers to conduct short-term fellowships here in Washington, D.C. We also have a number of cultural programs that include movie screenings that help to shed some light on the cultural aspects of Taiwan's society. I'll be remiss if we started today's program without also thanking of course, our co-founders, our board of directors, advisors, and of course, our staff here at GTI who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. We are truly delighted to be able to bring to our audience today's program a book talk with Abraham Denmark on his new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century: Empowering Allies and Partners. And while much ink has been spilled in recent years about the rising strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, Denmark argues that U.S. strategy toward the region remains in flux, especially as we are faced with a rising, increasingly emboldened China. Yet the Trump administration has largely relied on unilateral efforts to achieve its goals. In this timely new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Abe contends that this approach is insufficient. And he details the history of U.S. alliances. He puts forward a really forceful and compelling argument for the need to increase U.S. support for an engagement with allies and partners in the region. Abe is someone who knows a lot about U.S. strategy and alliances in the Indo-Pacific. He is currently the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a senior fellow at the center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He's also an adjunct associate professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and worked as Senior Vice President for Political and Security Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research at the Center for New American Security, as well as having held several positions in the U.S. intelligence community. As a reminder to all our online audience members, the questions for the author may either be sent by email to contact@globaltaiwan.org or through the chat function on our YouTube page. I will repeat these instructions later as we approach the 15-minute mark to the close of today's discussion, which is when we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So Abe, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Russell. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too. So let's get started. As I often like to do with these book talks, is I really want to get sort of lay out the big picture, really understand really what motivates authors who are able to write these long books. What made you to really put in the time to write this book, and really what the main thesis of this book.
Sure. Well, thanks. First, thanks so much for having me, Russell. I always like doing events with GTI. I think GTI is a critical voice in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and I'm just always very happy to be able to speak with you. To answer your question, I actually started this project. My wife would say it took me too long to finish this project. I actually started it about 5 years ago. Really with the idea of seeing the project as an opportunity to think more deeply about where our alliances and partners should go. In that we've been talking about our allies and partners that they need to do more for a long time, really since we've had allies and partners in Asia. But I noticed that in the discussion, there wasn't that much discussion about what our allies should be doing or why, or what the geopolitical environment was. There was not much discussion at that time of competition between China and the United States. And so I really wanted to just get all those thoughts and ideas out there into one place. And so this was, for me, just an opportunity to do that. But a few things changed in the writing of it. It's one of the reasons it took so long. First is I went into government when I was about halfway through with the manuscript to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. And after coming out of the Pentagon at the end of the Obama administration, I found that I'd learned a lot and had some different ideas and different thoughts about where our alliances could go. But also, it was the beginning of the Trump administration. And President Trump, even before he was elected, was asking some fundamental questions about the role of our alliances and partnerships and seeing things in a very different way than the United States had traditionally seen our alliances and partnerships. So I wanted to be able to address some of those fundamental questions that were being asked. And to me, the president's skepticism has only deepened over the years. And so for me, the importance of writing about what our alliances could be and the role that they play, I think, is just grown to my estimation. So those were really where I began the book, asking, what do we want with our allies and partners? What role do they play? And I wanted to structure the book a bit differently than most American strategy books, in that most of us who write about strategy are educated along the same lines. We talk about ends, ways, and means, and that's our structure. That this is what we want to accomplish. This is what we need to do, and this is the resources we need to do that. Instead, I kind of took a more Chinese approach to writing things. When you read Chinese strategies, they talk much more about the strategic environment and the broader trends of the international system, and then how their country fits into that and what it means for their country. And so I tried to take a bit of both, because one of the downsides of the Chinese model is that a lot of the goals are left unstated. And so I tried to use a bit both, to talk about the strategic environment that the United States is operating in, but also to talk about more specifically about what our objectives should be and what the nature of U.S.-China competition would be. And so that's really the goal here. And the core argument is that in Asia especially, the regional order, the rules of the road, the operating system that dictates how states manage conflicting interests, how states relate with one another, since the end of the Second World War has been a liberal international order based on international laws, norms, and international institutions, which was backed up by American power and American leadership. And that since the end of the Second World War, it's been remarkably successful in terms of stability, in terms of prosperity, and that Asia's rise beyond, I think, can be attributed to the decisions of national leaders, the hard work of the people, but also the international order that those decisions were made in. That American leadership provided a trade conducive, stable environment that allowed multiple countries across Asia to thrive. First, countries like Korea and Japan, and then Taiwan, and then in Southeast Asia, and more recently China and India. But the argument, and where I think the turn of the book is that some of the results of this system is leading to uncertainties about the long-term reliability and the long-term survivability of this liberal order, specifically pointing to two factors: deepening questions and concerns about the reliability of American power, and second, the rise of China and the implications that that would have for the liberal order. And so the book goes into why countries are questioning the reliability of American power, the adequacy of American power, but also it goes into China and what China wants. I think it has a bit of a different take than a lot of other analysts of Asia have when it comes to China. I'll gloss over the questions about American reliability. We can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested. But for the purposes of our discussion, in terms of what China is looking for, the way I describe it, starting with Xi Jinping and his description of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That's really got me questioning what is China actually looking for, because in their official statements, China, at least at first, was very unclear about what this new era actually meant. So I went about interviewing Chinese officials, Chinese scholars, and the best explanation I heard was really juxtaposing Xi Jinping with Mao and Deng, to say that under Mao, China stood up, under Deng, China got rich, and under Xi, China will grow powerful. So the goal for this new era is really to translate this economic power into geopolitical power. And so when I describe what China is looking for, I go into what they describe as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, in which they seek to make sure that China is stable and prosperous at home, that it is regionally dominant, globally influential, and really putting China at the center of an informal hierarchical system. And I highlight a term that to me is a good way to get into China's approach to these things. A term that one hears Chinese diplomats use a lot. It's a hebutong, this harmony but not uniformity. It's a reference to an old Confucian aphorism that the gentleman aims at harmony and not at uniformity, that the mean man aims at uniformity but not at harmony. And the way this sort of translates when you run this through the universal translator is that from Beijing's view, China does not seek to explicitly dominate the international sphere, but rather to ensure that seeks that it can do what it likes, and that its attitude is that the rest of the world needs to live in harmony with China as China pursues its interests. There's a great example of that just a few months ago when the Chinese ambassador to the United States appeared on Fareed Zakaria's show on CNN. And Zakaria pressed him on China's oppressions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, its violation of the one country, two systems principle with Hong Kong, its assertiveness in the East and South China Seas. And the ambassador said something really interesting in reaction to all this. He said, I'm quoting here, the fundamental question for the United States is very simple. Is the United States ready or willing to live with another country with very different culture, very different political and economic system, whether the United States is ready to live with it in peace or cooperate on so many and still growing challenges? I think it's a real choice. This is a fundamental choice people have to make. It's the idea that China's doing what it seeks, China's doing what it wants, and it's up to China, it's up to the rest of the world, to the United States, to decide whether or not it's going to live in harmony with that. And so that's a key point there in terms of what China's looking for. I call it an exceptionalist approach to international affairs. And it's different from American exceptionalism, which is based on our sense that the United States plays a special role in the world because of our ideas, because of our history, and because of the principles that have guided our country. Whereas from a Chinese point of view, it's more based on their history, their civilizational identity. And so in the international order, the way that translates is that they're not seeking to explicitly tear down the international system. They're not a revolutionary power the way they had been under Mao. Rather, I describe them as exceptionalists. They're fine with many aspects of the international order, but they seek to change parts of it in a very self-serving way. And the example I used, I think, is the clearest is when it comes to freedom of navigation in international waterways. That when it comes to Chinese forces sailing within 12 nautical miles of other countries' islands, be it the Aleutian Islands in Alaska or Japanese islands or into the Indian Ocean, they have no problem doing that because it's protected and consistent with international law. But when it comes to the South China Sea, they object to that, to foreign countries operating near Chinese claimed features in the South China Sea. And when pressed on this, what Chinese officials tend to say is some version of, we totally support freedom of navigation. We will not reduce freedom of navigation in any way. However, these are very sensitive places, so maybe you need to be careful and defer to Chinese sensitivities in this specific area. And that, to me, is an example of that exceptionalist approach. So the book makes the argument from there that as the United States and China compete, we'll be competing primarily in two different areas. The first is in order, competing over order, the future of the liberal order. And second is over power. Remember, I described that order and power are very much linked in Asia. And so I think they need to be very much linked in our strategy, that we're not going to be able to sustain a liberal order without the necessary geopolitical power, but also our power needs to have context, needs to have purpose. And to me, sustaining liberal order is a very good purpose of that, both because it supports American interests, but also it's very attractive in terms of our allies and partners. And to me, though that's going to be a major battleground of our competition, is the alignment of allies and partners, of middle powers in Asia. And so the book spends a lot of time talking about how our allies and partners view US and China competition. Broadly speaking, that they seek to hedge, maintain a good economic relationship with China. Broadly speaking, they're uncomfortable with pressure to abandon a hedging strategy to explicitly align with one side or another. So looking forward, I describe what I think is going to be what US-China competition is going to look like, and that's going to be very different from what US-Soviet competition had looked like, for example, during the Cold War, in that this idea of geographic spheres of influence, to me, seems quite outdated for a number of reasons, technology being a major piece of it, that instead of geographic spheres of influence where we carve up the world. Rather, the book talks about functional spheres of influence, where the United States and China would develop different ecosystems across all elements of national power, be it trade communities, security mechanisms, technology standards, development assistance, and that middle powers would view competition across these different areas of national power and pick and choose, really, in that based on their interests, they may want to engage with China when it comes to the trade community, but with the United States when it comes to security mechanisms. And so to me, what that means for the United States is that we need to have compelling alternatives to what China is offering. That so far, our strategy in a lot of these areas has been to just say no, to tell our allies and partners, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't let Huawei into your networks, you can't engage with BRI, or you shouldn't engage with BRI. But we don't really have a good, compelling alternative for these countries. And that, to me, is keeping the United States at a disadvantage. So broadly, not to get to belabor the point, one of the main arguments of the book is that the best way the United States can compete with China, both over power and order, is to empower our allies and partners, to see them as tremendous strategic assets rather than as burdens, and to empower them to contribute more to our principles, to a revitalized liberal order for the 21st century, to oppose China's exceptionalist objectives, and to counteract changes to the regional balance of power. And it describes doing that in a lot of different ways, but broadly speaking, it argues that the United States needs to reconceive of alliances rather than just being military-centric, being a platform for cooperation across all elements of national power, to build trade trade environments to emphasize all those areas of competition that make sure that the United States has these compelling alternatives that I mentioned before. And there's a security piece to it of making them more capable to defend themselves, to assert liberal principles in international spaces, and it applies across there. So I understand that I want to be able to have a conversation, but that's the sort of the basic pieces of it. The other piece I'd mention for the audience to close out is that the first half of the book sort of describes this framework, the environment and the framework of how to think about strategy, but really the second half of the book is a country by country analysis that goes into what the United States can do with each of these specific countries, including Taiwan. So that the goal is to be sort of theoretical, to be theoretical, but also fairly practical about what we can actually do within this strategic framework that the book constructs. I hope that helps give you sort of an overview of where things are.
Abe, that's excellent. Really, a superb overview, and you touched on so many points that I really wanted to dig into. And I especially liked how you framed it, right? I mean, you're looking at structure, and oftentimes we're so, in our analysis, so direct in looking at a principal agent and analyzing that, but we forget about the environment and the condition that shape agency. And so I think I think I want to dig into that a bit more. And then you brought this up in your opening where you discuss the difference between power and order, and I want you to dig into that a bit more and really sort of what is the distinction that you make between power and order, and really how are they relevant to the nature of the ongoing competition between the United States and China, and also for the in the Indo-Pacific region. Can you sort of really just hone in on that a bit more, and then so we can have more details? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks. And this is really one of the core ideas that the book sets out in the beginning, is making a distinction between power and order. And part of this just came out of a pet peeve of mine that I've been in innumerable discussions, both outside and inside of government, with Chinese scholars, Chinese officials, when the two ideas get intermixed. And I think it leads to unclear discussions and concerns. I think that when, and a lot of this comes from when China was talking a lot about its peaceful rise, that a lot of Americans, when we heard peaceful rise, a lot of Americans focused on the word peaceful, which to me implies order, how power is used. Whereas when Chinese officials and Chinese scholars, they seem to me, at least, to emphasize more of the rise part, which to me is more about power. So a lot of discussions that I've had in American academic circles has been Chinese officials talking about the rise of China, American officials talking about their concerns that China's policies may threaten the established order, may challenge stability and prosperity. But Chinese interlocutors would interpret that as being critical of Chinese rising power, rather than the application of that power, the implications of that for regional order. So I wanted to make very clear what we were talking about, that they're interlinked. And the book goes into some of the history about how the rise of different powers in Asia has led to different orders, including Chinese hegemony for much of its history for centuries ago. But the idea that power is really something that oftentimes can be measured, be it wealth or military might or political influence, whereas order is sort of the rules of the road, the operating system that countries live in, that manages the contradictory interests of states, and that different orders are shaped by the distribution of power in the system. And so the argument is that the post-war order, which was dominated by primarily American power, led to created a liberal order that was beneficial to everybody, including China. And then it talks about what the Chinese concerns would be about liberal order, what a Chinese-centric order would look like, and the implications of that. But to be honest, and I get into this less in the book, in that it talks about what the Chinese would like to see. But my sense is that the chances of a Chinese-led order are fairly low, in that there's very little appetite for Chinese leadership in the region. I think that, to me, and the book does get into this a bit when it talks about what would happen if the United States doesn't empower its allies and partners more. I see the options really as being either a return to a revitalized liberal order with American leadership and allies and partners contributing, or really an order that's more atomized, that's less stable, less prosperous, and countries are just more self-reliant. Especially the major powers, I see very little interest in falling behind Beijing's leadership. Rather, it seems to be something that they'd live with rather than support.
Abe, if I just interject here, I mean, you talk about American perceptions of power and order and Chinese perceptions of power and order. How do Asian countries' perceptions of power and order influence U.S. competition and this this is the preservation of this order, that this liberal order that you talk about, or perhaps a reshaping of a new order? How does that sort of factor into the dynamics that you are underscoring right now?
Yeah. So each country in Asia is different, obviously, and they have different approaches to these things. But I'll give three examples, I think, kind of typify three different approaches that I came across in the region when it comes to these discussions. The first is a more among countries that are generally friendly with the United States, larger countries like Japan, Korea to a lesser extent, Taiwan, Australia, in which they're quite supportive of the existing liberal order and the existing structure of things. Then there's several other smaller countries that are also supportive in that they see that order, laws, norms, institutions gives them protection and gives them some sway and voice, when otherwise, if it was just Singapore, for example, is a huge supporter of international laws and institutions, in large part because if it weren't for them, Singapore's voice would be much smaller. So even countries that don't have liberal governments, like Vietnam, are still supportive of many aspects of a liberal order because they see it as beneficial to their interests as a smaller country amongst bigger countries. And then the third, I'd say, is countries that have sort of a visceral objection to senses of alignment, like Indonesia, India, in which talking about a US-led order raises some concerns, which is why in the book I talk more about principles, that what needs to drive a regional order is not hard concerns of power, that we need to preserve American dominance, but rather working with allies towards shared principles and interests, that if one were to talk to Indian officials or Indian scholars about sustaining American dominance in the region, you get a very different discussion than if you talk about working together to preserve freedom of navigation on the high seas, because they speak to different aspects of Indian strategic culture. So to me, you get different approaches, but broadly speaking, unless you're talking to Chinese officials or countries that are firmly within Beijing's hand, like smaller countries like Cambodia, you get a lot of support for at least the principles of a liberal order, but at the same time, the recognition that as smaller countries, their ability to really stand up to Beijing is quite limited without getting the power aspect of this right too. And for that, the United States plays a really an indispensable role.
Hey, you mentioned earlier that you saw China as not a revolutionary power in the sense that it does not seek to overthrow the order, but it may be seeking to change it in fundamental ways. Allow me to play the opposing counsel for a moment here. How could the United States convince China to preserve an order that Beijing probably sees as inimical to its interests? It sees this liberal democratic environment that it's in, and it's obviously concerned, as reflected by statements made by Chinese leaders and documents that they've issued, such as document number 9 regarding the liberal influences in Chinese society. And Beijing may believe that the existing order was created when China was weak, and since it's stronger, it's more powerful now. It wants to and believes that it should have a say in how the order should be, and perhaps closer to its image. So, how does the United States convince China that preserving the order as it exists now is actually in its interests?
Yeah, I think it's piecemeal. When if you look at China's approach to the international system, it's much more complex than just to say that they're a status quo power or a revolutionary power. That in some areas they've been quite supportive of the existing system. Like, for example, when it comes to non-proliferation, China was initially skeptical, initially hostile to the idea, but over time saw that it was in its interests and then became a status quo power in that area. So I think it's issue by issue and demonstrating to the Chinese that whatever this is in their interest. I think that we're not going to get to a time where the United States and China agree on all aspects of every issue. But I do believe that if the United States engages in international institutions robustly, fully empowers its diplomats, engages in robust economic engagement, development assistance, works with allies and partners, that in areas where we disagree, we can effectively compete with them. I think that there are some areas where we should be able to cooperate, where our interests overlap, and that could be related to issues of international order. But that should not undermine or limit our ability to compete with them in areas where our interests do not overlap, where they diverge. Even during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the competition was much more existential than it is today with the Chinese, we were still able to cooperate in areas of mutual interest. So I don't see why that would be a challenge with China. But it requires us to think differently and to be careful in our engagements with the Chinese. One of my pet peeves that I've heard for a long time in US discussions about China has been when people say that we need to find the right balance between competition and cooperation. Because that to me suggests that they're sort of opposite of one another and mutually exclusive, and that if we do more of one, then the other one goes down. Excuse me. Whereas I think in reality, going forward, both are going to probably intensify going forward. That we'll be competing more and cooperating more as China becomes more powerful. The challenge, though, that we have and why we need to be careful is that Beijing is very good at understanding our priorities and using them against us. So if the United States were to repeat language that we've used before to say, we cannot fix climate change without China, in Beijing, that sounds a signal of you can leverage climate change against us. And quickly you start to hear things like, well, we'd love to work with you on climate change, but how could we do that if you're, say, whatever, flying ops in the South China Sea or selling arms to Taiwan or what have you. And to me, the way to counteract that is to not play that game and just say, we have our principles, we have our policies, we'll cooperate with you in this area. And if you want to help work with us on that, great. But either way, we're going to still do this other thing because it's in our interest to do that. And it requires discipline, it requires sticking to your principles. But I think that way we'll be able to work with them in areas where we can and compete in areas where we must.
That's great. I think that's a great rebuttal and a good response. I'd like to stick with the bigger picture still, and before we sort of dive into the alliances, which is one of the core focus of your book. And then you sort of indicated what you think about this already, but this is the bigger picture because I do think this is sort of it's an overarching context of the broader debate that is sort of moving us in fundamental ways to a new sort of paradigm of how we envision U.S.-China competition, and it's that some officials and experts also think that we are now in a quote new Cold War with China. And let me quote something first from Michael Collins, who is was then or maybe still right now the Deputy Assistant Director of the CIA's East Asia Mission Center. And he said this at the Aspen Security Conference in 2018, and I quote here: "I would argue that what they're waging, the Chinese Communist Party waging against us, is fundamentally a Cold War, a Cold War not like we saw during the Cold War." And he's referencing here, of course, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but a Cold War by definition. End quote. How do you respond to that? I mean, is he not correct in the sense that while it's not the Cold War with the Soviet Union, it is nonetheless a kind of a Cold War. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate that's been happening, and the way I've heard it referenced is Cold War, no capitals instead of Cold War with this capital C and a capital W. And Michael Collins I've known him a long time. He's a brilliant analyst, and so I take everything that he says very seriously. But to my mind, the only way we could describe U.S.-China dynamics now to be a Cold War is if we define Cold War down to mean very little other than a major power competition. Because I'm not really sure what a Cold War, but not the Cold War, what that actually means. I think it's a fairly ill-defined term, and I've yet to see a definition of what a Cold War means. That doesn't just mean that's not just a synonym for major power competition. I do think we're in a major competition with the Chinese, but I think we need to be very careful, and this is why I don't use the term New Cold War. We need to be very careful about historical analogies. Actually, separate from my book, I published a piece a couple of weeks ago on this. It was related to the 75th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War, which was just a few weeks ago. And it described how the US how American officials have in the past misused historical analogies in a way that limited and shaped their approach to an international challenge in a way that really undermined our ability to navigate the challenge. So the example that I use in the book is the war in Vietnam. That at the time, the analogy that everybody was using was Munich. That we should have stopped Hitler in Munich, and we didn't, and therefore we need to stop the communists now in Vietnam before they flood all of Asia. That was the analogy at the time. The problem was that it was the idea of Munich was completely stripped of all context, and the idea of Vietnam was stripped of all context. So to me, looking at the Cold War does offer some lessons that are important for the US-China competition. But there's also, I think, some very important differences that if we gloss over them, then it could drive us in a direction that's unhelpful for our own ability to compete with the Chinese. So I think for any historical analogy, we need to be careful about context. We need to be careful about shaping unnecessarily our views and limiting ourselves in ways that blind us to the realities of what's happening. So the reason I try to avoid those sorts of historical analogies in my book is because I see the competition is very different from anything we've had before. And we need to understand those differences as much as we need to understand the historical antecedents.
Okay, thanks for that. That's I think let's shift gear now. Let's move over to the crux of your book, and let's talk about the alliance system. And maybe I think maybe some context here will be helpful in terms of our audience members to just get a sense in terms of your understanding and the history of the U.S. alliance systems and how you've seen it change over time and really where it needs to, where you see it needs to go, which is obviously the focus of your book.
Sure. So the alliance system in Asia evolved very differently from that of what we have in Europe. And it's a point that I make to non-Asia specialists all the time. And it's a point that still needs to be made. I don't know if you saw that the Deputy Secretary of State just yesterday talked about turning the Quad with Australia and India and Japan into a Asian-style NATO, which to me is exactly the wrong message to send to some of those countries. But they're different for a number of reasons, in part because unlike in Europe, Japan still had significant forces out in the field when the fighting stopped. And so the disposition of a lot of those countries was less obvious and had to be negotiated. There's still a lot of lingering animosities among Asian countries in ways that Europe did not experience after the war, at least to that same degree. But more importantly and more significantly, there's a great book by Victor Cha called Power Play that I point you to, where a lot of the US alliances, at least initially, were established in Asia, at least partially to limit and to constrain our allies. That there was concern that Chiang Kai-shek would try to invade the mainland, that the Japanese would remilitarize, that South Korea would go north and try to reunify by force. So there was a sense that our alliances, unlike in Europe where we're trying to rebuild and strengthen them, there was a sense that we also, in Asia, we needed to sort of restrain our allies. That changed fairly quickly into the 50s, where we're trying to get our allies and partners to do more. But that historical roots, I think, still is why we have a hub and spoke system in Asia, unlike the collective security arrangement that we have in Europe. And so what the book argues for is that as we seek to empower allies and partners, that we need to start to move beyond a hub and spoke system, not to collective security agreements like we have in Europe, but rather to more of a networked approach, where we have a hub and spoke at the core, but encouraging more interrelationships among our allies and partners, these multilaterals and minilaterals that we start to see, like the Quad, and like a lot of the trilaterals before that, like the trilateral between the United States, Japan, and Korea, because a lot of these countries share the same interests, the same values, and some of the same threat perceptions, and that we can be more effective if we work together than if we work separately in the same direction. So that's sort of the underlying ideas of a more networked approach. It's not recreating what we have in Europe. It's building on the strengths of what we have and adapting it to what we need, what I think we're going to need in the 21st century.
To be fair, I think the quote from the Deputy Secretary Began was that, or at least the context was that the United States would not move on establishing something like an Asian NATO until Asian allies and partners are ready for it. So it's not sort of calling for the immediate sort of establishment of such an Asian, so-called Asian NATO, but a more formalized structure, I think, was what he was calling for. I'm going to go on a limb here and guess that you think that the Trump administration has not been very good at alliance management. What, in your view, and I could correct me if I'm wrong, but what, in your view, are the keys to good alliance management?
Yeah, I think that ultimately there's a foundational different understanding of our alliances. That the president, for decades, has been consistent in his view that our alliances are unfair, that our allies take advantage of the United States, and that it's not in our interest to be engaged in this way with so many countries around the world. I fundamentally see that in a different way. That I see these relationships as tremendous strategic assets for American power, both as conduits of American power, but also as partners, working with us along shared interests, that they're value added. And that in a competition with China, they are a huge advantage that the United States has that China doesn't have. So to me, alliance management, good alliance management requires a few things. It requires having a fundamental understanding of the value and purpose of those alliances, why it's in your interests, but also a vision of how our allies see the world and how our allies see the role of the alliance from their perspective, and working with them in shared interests towards our national objectives. That alliance does not mean it's not a money-making scheme. It's not a way for one country to take advantage of another, but it's also not a mechanism for domination. Our allies and partners have their views. We have differing views. We negotiate, we argue. Sometimes we can't find an agreement, but ultimately it means working within a shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, and that having a strong relationship between the two of us is in our mutual interest.
Abe, I mean, I think this, our discussions thus far has really only scratched the surface of really what a very compelling and authoritative book on U.S. alliance systems. But I do want to, obviously shift gear right now and focus a bit on Taiwan, given obviously we're a GTI here, and also leave some time for audience Q&A. And I noticed that there are a number of good questions from the audience already that's coming in, that came in. So. The Assistant Secretary of State, Dave Stilwell, gave what I would describe as a quite major Taiwan policy speech, at least in recent memory, in terms of a speech focused entirely on Taiwan policy. in addition to announcing, sort of new economic dialogues with Taiwan, he announced that the United States declassified some key cables with regards to the six assurances and negotiations in the third communique. What's your sort of, and I especially like how you framed the U.S.-Taiwan relation in a global context, like the global, in partnership and prosperity. But what are your thoughts about the speech, and where do you see sort of the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations going?
Yeah, I thought it was a good speech. Just as background, Dave Stilwell, when he was his last job was in the Joint Staff. He was my counterpart when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He was my Joint Staff counterpart. So I've always had a very good relationship with him. I think he's terrific. I was glad that they made the speech to make clear where the Trump administration is when it comes to Taiwan policy. I was glad that they declassified those memos about the six assurances. I think it allows for a more open and informed discussion. I was glad they did that. I'm glad that they are beginning a economic dialogue building on the Tsai administration's decisions to open up policy on beef and pork. I think those are all good things. I had a few concerns in questions about some of the pieces of his speech. Overall, though, I thought it was largely consistent with previous administrations. I was a little. I got to tell you, I first heard about it over Twitter, seeing some friends tweeting about it, saying it's great to see the United States clarify its commitments to Taiwan, and this is such a major change. And then I read the speech, and I thought it was quite consistent with past policy, and I didn't really see a major shift there. The two things that jumped out at me, though, to highlight, one was he said, I'm quoting here, that we no longer have the luxury of assuming that Beijing will live up to its commitment to peacefully resolve its differences with Taipei, as it promised us in the three joint communiques. I think I'm supportive of the idea that promising a commitment to peacefully resolving the dispute, I think is important. But in terms of we no longer have the luxury of assuming that Beijing will live up to its commitments, having worked in both the Obama administration and in the Bush administration, I am not aware of any time where we have assumed that Beijing will do this peacefully, especially since China has never renounced the use of force. So I don't know what he's referring to there, but I think it raises a question. The other piece is his remarks about the international organizations, how we need to work more with Taiwan on their participation in international organizations, which I entirely support, and actually talk about that in my book. But to me, the only way we can get Taiwan to be engaged in international organizations is if the United States is engaged in international organizations. And if we're committed and we're forceful in there. You may recall that the Trump administration just decided to withdraw funding in support of the World Health Organization. It's unclear to me how we can convince the WHO to admit, or the WHA to admit Taiwan if we're not participating. And I'd also note that our first time we appointed an ambassador to the organization that oversees the WHO was appointed in October of 2019. That for more than 2 years before that, the ambassadorship was open. And he also referenced ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and I noticed our representative to there is a person whose last job, he was the director of the Presidential Personnel Office at the White House. And I think that just references the Trump administration's broader lack of interest in international institutions and multilateral organizations, which, that's their policy, that's fine. But to me, it's unclear how we can, on one hand, distance ourselves from international institutions, but on the other hand, convince those institutions to make policy adjustments according to our preferences. So to me, the best way to influence these institutions and to compete with the Chinese in these institutions, and what I talk about in my book, is to go all in on these institutions, to engage our allies and partners, and work together and collaborate on efforts to drive these things. And that Taiwan, I think, should be a big part of it, that the United States and our allies and partners should be advocating for Taiwan's participation in organizations like ACAO and the WHA. But in order to do that, we have to be engaged, we have to be influential. And I don't see that we've really done the background work in order to get there. But overall, I'm glad that General Stilwell talked about Taiwan. I think there's broad bipartisan support for helping Taiwan and supporting Taiwan, consistent with the One China policy. And I was glad that he raised the case. I'm glad that we're making progress on our economic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Now, before I move to the audience questions, and I do want to sort of tie this back, and you were, I think you did that also with your response to the Stilwell speech. And I want to tie this back to your book, and that is, this is a book primarily focused on the U.S. and what the U.S. should do. But what can specifically here? Now, let's talk about Taiwan. Do to support the preservation of this liberal world order that you're referring to? Like specifically, what do you think Taiwan can and should be doing to help further the preservation of this liberal world order?
Yeah, I think that every day that Taiwan exists is a statement in favor of the success of political and economic liberalism. That there's things that we could do to strengthen Taiwan's role, be it with economic diversification, and I think making agreements, a bilateral agreement with Taiwan would be a good first step towards more broadly diversifying Taiwan's economy, burgeoning its international space the way we just talked about, but also supporting Taiwan's ability to defend itself, as the Taiwan Relations Act describes. To me, is all part of what we can do to help Taiwan. And frankly, just Taiwan's participation in these international organizations, to me, is the first step. And Taiwan's participation in the international community as appropriate, to me, is a major step towards supporting a liberal order, because I have full confidence that Taiwan remains committed to those liberal principles that have been so important to to the success of the post-war order. So to me, I'm less concerned about getting Taiwan in the right space. I think Taiwan's there when it comes to the importance of international laws and norms and the importance of international institutions. We just need to make sure that Taiwan has a voice, because I firmly believe that once Taiwan has that voice, I'm confident that they would be a voice that we would be very supportive of. There's a few things that I think that may be helpful when it comes to South China Sea policy and the importance of freedom of navigation. But to me, the first step is to make sure that Taiwan has the ability to speak for itself.
Thank you very much. Now, I have plenty of questions for Abe that I've prepared, but I am not going to be able to get through them, and because I do want to get to the audience Q&A, and this is and this book, Abe's book, is so critically important to, I think, not only broader Asian policy, but of course for Taiwan policy as well, and which is why I think it's been such a fascinating discussion, and I wish we had more time, but we are running short on time, and so I do want to get to the audience Q&A. The first question is from Joe Bosco, who is an ambassador with GTI and also formerly with the Department of Defense. What is your current thinking on whether it is finally time for strategic clarity on U.S. intention to defend Taiwan? It seems there is wide recognition that strategic ambiguity has not worked to dissuade Communist China from preparing to attack Taiwan and deter the U.S. from intervening. Should Trump and Biden support the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act?
Yeah, well, I can't comment on any pending legislation, but I can just give a sense of these pieces. I understand that questions about clarifying U.S. commitments is in the discussion, is under debate. Elbridge Colby is an old friend of mine, and he's written very eloquently and forcefully on these issues, and I completely see the argument. But I don't agree with it. I think that broadly speaking, the decision to retain some degree of ambiguity about American commitments to the defense of Taiwan, I think is ultimately in our interest and actually in the interest of Taiwan. And in terms of Joe's question, the only piece I would disagree with is the idea that strategic ambiguity has not worked. I think it's worked fairly well in that the use of force has not occurred, that at least so far as we know, China has to date been deterred. And at the same, and the cross-strait dynamic, although it's certainly concerning, has been relatively stable. It's of course the military balance has not been trending in a positive direction from our standpoint. There's a lot that we need to do, and in my book, I talk a lot about what the things that we need to do. But I don't think that ending ambiguity and making an explicit commitment to Taiwan's defense would be in the U.S. interest or in the interest of Taiwan. But that's my reading of the way things are now. If things were to change, I think U.S. policy needs to adjust to realities. You may recall that the U.S.-Sino mutual defense treaty was signed. I think it was ratified like 6 months into a crisis with the mainland. So we've been here before. We've been in that sort of a situation before, where we actually signed a treaty with the government in Taipei in the middle of a crisis. So to me, that option should stay on the table. I wouldn't say they would never make sense, but my reading of the way things are now suggests that so far strategic ambiguity has been successful, and I don't see a compelling reason to change it. Although I think the arguments that have been made have been quite strong, and I understand where they're coming from. At this point, I just don't agree.
Thank you for that interesting response. Next question is from Drake Long with the Radio Free Asia. The question is, absent any participation in multilateral trade deals, how can or is the U.S. able to integrate itself into Southeast Asia emerging economic architecture?
Yeah. I was in favor of TPP during the Obama administration. I testified to that fact before Congress. And I still think that joining TPP would have been a smart strategic decision from the United States. I never made the economic argument. I'm not an economist. I don't feel qualified to make an economic argument one way or the other. But to me, the strategic argument makes a lot of sense. What we've seen since the United States withdrew from the TPP negotiations has been that the region's moving on without us, that the Japanese organized and signed the CPTPP, which is less high quality than what we would have gotten with TPP, but it is some degree of a fairly liberal regional economic grouping that is quite important. And to me, the United States at some point should find a way to plug into that. And I think we would have a lot of leverage to be able to increase its quality, to make sure that it's addressing our concerns and interests. But I do think that there's a way for us to plug in, but it would require us to make some pretty tough decisions when it comes to trade policy. And trade is a difficult issue now for across the political spectrum in the United States. And so I don't expect that it would happen anytime soon, regardless of how the next presidential election comes out. But the strategic imperative to me is undeniable. And if we don't sign a multilateral trade agreement that involves Southeast Asia, we can try to negotiate a bunch of bilateral agreements, but it would never live up to the breadth, both economically and geopolitically, of what a multilateral agreement would do.
I mean, just following on that, how likely do you see a potential second term for Trump, or perhaps a different administration ability to return to a CPTPP, or the likelihood of that?
Yeah, I think that from I would normally say 0% likelihood with the second Trump administration, but my ability to predict the president's decision making has been quite limited. So I never say nothing, never say never with President Trump. So I'd say it's extremely unlikely. With the Biden administration, to me, it's unclear. Looking at the statements of what people affiliated with the campaign have been saying, it's unclear to me if there's a real impetus for such a move. Again, just speaking for myself here.
Sure.
I suspect that the main focus would be on rebuilding the American economy out of the hole that we're in right now, and that discussions of major trade deals would probably come after that, after we're able to dig ourselves out. But it's very early. I don't think that there's much of a trade agenda set that I've seen publicly. So to me, it's an open question. But my expectation would be that it would be be at the top of the agenda for any new administration.
Uh, Thanks, Dave. I know I do want to get to a few more questions, but I hope, Dave, that you have a few more minutes to stay on and answer. I do want to get a couple more questions from our audience here, and I do think they're related and interesting to the broader topic here that we're talking about. And this next question is from Stephen Smith, who is a consultant, unaffiliated. In your opinion, how likely is that there will be a military conflict between the United States and China in the next few years? How can such a conflict be avoided?
I think it's quite unlikely. Neither side wants a conflict. Both sides see a conflict as inimical to their interests. To me, the most likely driver of a conflict would come from one of either two directions. One would be an accidental incident. If you think back to the 2001 EP3 incident, I think our ability to navigate a similar event is much more diminished now than it was in 2001. And that's not a mechanical problem. A lot of people will defer to the need for us to build more mechanisms for dialogue and hotlines and things like that. We actually have a good amount of hotlines. To me, it's a statement it's more of a statement about the political environment that both leaderships are in, that I think both sides would be very reluctant to back down if such a crisis were to happen again. And escalation could happen quite quickly in those sorts of scenarios. And so we've tried to address that. I actually negotiated and concluded some agreements with the PLA, seeking to reduce incidents between our aircraft and developing more mechanisms for crisis communications. I think they're somewhat effective, but they don't change the political environment. So more engagement with the Chinese, I think, would help. But to me, crisis management is a key asset that we need to work on with the Chinese, with the PLA, in order to avoid those. The second way that a crisis, I think, could come about would be if the Chinese were to do something that would impugn U.S. alliance commitments, be it with Japan or the Philippines or South Korea even, that could trigger an American response that I think could surprise the Chinese. And so I, in my personal capacity, in my limited interactions with Chinese scholars since I left government, I always try to emphasize that they need to take these alliance commitments seriously. And I point to scholarship about like looking at Gilpin and things like that, and authors like that about how geopolitical change and the concerns about reputation could drive crises more to escalate more than they would otherwise. So to me, those are very sensitive areas that I think could lead to an escalation that might surprise the Chinese and how the Americans respond.
For the next question, I want it's going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, Abe. And this is going to, I want to rephrase this a little bit. This is from Edmund Luzine, Adirondack Capital International, LLC. And the question is essentially about the resiliency and durability of the Chinese Communist Party. And to what and how do you view Asia in a post-CCP China?
Yeah. The Chinese Communist Party is under a degree of pressure that is, I think, difficult for those of us in the United States to really understand. And the way I describe it is, if you look at the previous 10 years, just the internal migration, China averaged about 10 million people moving from the rural parts to the cities every year. And if you could just imagine the logistical challenges of a new New York City being built every year, year after year, imagine the water, the food, the electricity, the schooling, the sanitation involved in supporting that kind of growth is just unimaginable. And the stresses that the Chinese Communist Party is facing when it comes to environmental degradation, urbanization, what the Chinese would call informatization, really is beyond anything that we can appreciate. So one of the points my book makes actually is that the Chinese approach to foreign policy is still very much driven by its domestic concerns, which is still overriding. And I think it's getting harder as their economy slows down. They're facing more pressure, which I think is why you're seeing more crackdowns on dissent, on minorities, and greater tightening of civil rights of their people. In terms of its survivability, I think that these sorts of, as we saw during the Arab Spring, these systems exist for decades and they work okay until one day they don't work anymore. So I think the Chinese Communist Party has been under a lot worse during the Cultural Revolution in 1989, and it survived that. So I'm not one who counts the party out. I think it's demonstrated itself to be quite resilient, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow it may find that what worked before doesn't work anymore. Some people will say that a post-CCP China would still be a threat, would still be a challenge because of nationalism, because of the sheer scale of that. To me, I can't. It's impossible to know. I think I would much rather see just for the normative piece of it, rather than the strategic piece of it, I would much rather see a liberal and democratic China than a communist China, and deal with the geopolitical implications of that when they come. But to me, a liberal and democratic China would be better both from a normative and human rights perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective. And for the region.
We have a lot more questions that we could really go into, but I do want to close with this final question because this is related to sort of domestic political conditions in Asian countries and how that might affect, really U.S. relations with those countries. And this question is from Daniel Anaforian, who's a student. Are there any current domestic events in Asia, i.e. Prime Minister Abe of Japan stepping down, the Thai anti-monarchy protests, and etc., that could have a significant impact on U.S. relations with those countries? And perhaps maybe focus your analysis on the alliances and partnership that you think could maybe affect your calculus in terms of how the United States deals with those countries.
Sure. And one of the challenges of alliance management is that our allies and partners have their politics too. And as much as they've had to adjust to the United States under President Trump, we have to adjust to them as their politics change. So yeah, there's a lot of things that could change. I actually expect that, you mentioned Abe, I actually expect that the alliance is going to be relatively unaffected. I do think that Japan may come under more pressure from China and North Korea with Abe just to test as a testing move. But I think the alliance there is quite solid. I think sure there's things that could happen in a lot of these countries. I think there's a lot of people watching the Philippines and Duterte and seeing how that goes if the Philippines can get back to a more liberal and democratic approach to I shouldn't say democratic, a more liberal approach to its own politics, I think would help. I think there's some concerns about Burma and Vietnam, and that crackdowns on human rights there could impact the ability and willingness of the United States to engage them on issues of mutual interest like China. Similarly with India, some nationalistic trends and some less than liberal trends in India's domestic politics, I think at some point could affect the ability of the United States to engage with them, although I think that's further off. But broadly speaking, these countries see engagement with the United States as in their interest. And even as the politics change, be it in Taiwan or in Australia or in New Zealand, even in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, the strategic calculus of it doesn't change. And ultimately, even as we saw with Japan under Hatayama, ultimately they come back around to the inescapable logic that an alliance or partnership with the United States brings.
Hey, but thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. And we can really go on for hours, honestly. I mean, I have so many other questions I wanted to ask you and get your insights on. But really, like, as I mentioned earlier, just our discussion today really scratches the surface of Abe Denmark's new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century: Empowering Allies and Partners. And I cannot recommend enough that you go and purchase a copy of this book. And I think they're available for purchase on Amazon and on Woodrow Wilson Center's website. So do pick up your copy. And thank you again, Abe, so much for this discussion. And I look forward to having you back on in the future again to further this conversation. Thank you.
I really appreciate it, Russell. Thanks for having me.